was the Iranian drones. Now it's China. And so the hope strategy is that Russia eventually, 6 months, in a year, 2 years, and 3 years, eventually Russia's going to run out of weapons. Yeah. Can we keep Ukraine fighting until Russia runs out of weapons? I mean, that's, I try to piece it together. That's the only conclusion I can come up with.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Now, by the way, there was a long piece, a huge article in the Financial Times, desperately trying to find out whether, in fact, Russia can sustain the war. They were going through all the various reasons and factors why perhaps it could, perhaps it couldn't. But in the end, even that article, and that's the Financial Times, which is, you know, full-on neutron publication nowadays, even it couldn't quite bring itself to admit that this was actually going to happen. Well, you're absolutely right. That's what they're hoping for. But, you know, at the same time that they're hoping for it, and by the way, on missiles, the first reports, the first claims about the Russians running out of missiles, I read them in March of last year. You know, that was a year ago. So, I mean, you know, I remember reading in the Daily Telegraph in March that, you know, they were running out of missiles. And soon after, they said that they couldn't launch more missiles. The Russians were running out of missiles and they couldn't make any more because the engines for these missiles were made in Ukraine. So because Ukraine wasn't providing these engines to put inside these missiles, which the Russians were then going to launch against Ukraine itself, well, that would mean that the Russians were going to run out of missiles. And I read articles like this. They've been going on about this story for ages. And the same with artillery. You know, Russians are going to run out of artillery rounds, run out of tanks, run out of infantry fighting vehicles. And of course, it never happens. But that is the hope. That, except, of course, if they're really afraid that China is going to come to Russia's aid, if they really believe that, then surely they must realize that that strategy is hopeless. Because if Russia really does run out of weapons, but the Chinese are going to step in and provide them, and China's industrial capacity is greater than that of the US and Europe combined, well, what hope is there then? But they don't draw the conclusion that they should from that.
Yeah, they're stuck in this Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country mentality. It's been ingrained in their minds. It's been so internalized over so many decades that I don't think they can break free of that thinking. And I think it just baffles them that Russia actually can make missiles and ammo and stuff like that. They refuse to believe it. And so it's North Korea, it's Iran, and now it's China. That's where they're going to get it from. If we can just starve Russia off from China, then we've won. That's why you have Blinken coming out and saying, I'm 100% sure that Ukraine's going to win. That's why you had Kallas, the Estonian prime minister, say the same thing. 100% Ukraine's going to win. They believe that the key, the secret sauce to all of this is just isolate Russia from getting weapons from China, and game over. As long as we can sustain the Ukraine military, keep on sending their soldiers to the front line. If we can just keep Ukraine sending recruits to the front line for the next 6 months or the next year, then Russia will be done. It'll be over. That's how they're calculating this.
Absolutely. I mean,
I just think it just carries over from the thinking of the shock and awe sanctions, which is that Russia makes nothing, does nothing. It's just a gas station.
Exactly.
That's
right.
where this all originates from.
Absolutely, and you know, the other thing is now there's a massive hunt apparently to try and stop imports of semiconductors into Russia. I was just reading about this in the Financial Times, looking at Chekhov imports of semiconductors to Russia. Russia will import semiconductors from the Chinese. It's not been a problem for them. And I've already discussed semiconductors, the production of semiconductors in Russia many times. I'm not going to go over that. But you're absolutely right. They are stuck. They're stuck on these themes. I mean, again, I was reading a long series of pieces in the Daily Telegraph that Russians are running out of the necessary technologies, kit to do all of this. And, again, I remember at the start of last year, after the sanctions were imposed, when the sanctions didn't crater the Russian economy immediately, predictions that the Russian economy was going to implode in June. This is going to be the month where it's going to run out of spare parts. June came and went, and in fact, the Russian economy began an industrial surge, which continues. But they don't want to see that, they can't see that, they can't acknowledge that, because if they acknowledge it, then 40 years, 30 years of talking about the country being the gas station, which doesn't make anything, something which, as you absolutely rightly say, they've internalized and has become hardwired to them. That is something that would be proved to be untrue, and they can't face it. Because if they do face it, if it turns out that Russia isn't a gas station, it does have industrial and technological capacities greater than they imagine, then of course the whole neocon project collapses at its first post. It's already failed in the Middle East. If it fails in Russia, then it's failed completely. And that isn't something that they can acknowledge or face up to. And that's why they're in denial about it, as ideologues always are.
Yeah. Okay, let's close out the video, maybe talk about some of the geopolitical news.
Yeah, I mean,
we talked about the Munich Security Conference. We talked about Putin's speech to the Federal Assembly. We've talked about Wang Yi's trip to Moscow. We've talked about Biden and Kiev and Poland. There was Meloni, who made a trip to Kiev as well. There was Putin's big speech at it wasn't his speech. He showed up to the big rally at Luzhniki Stadium. I think, if someone saw the videos of Luzhniki, they would understand the massive level of support for the Putin government and for this special military operation. I mean, all you have to do is see a video of a sold-out stadium, and you understand that the breaking of Russia has completely failed. The sanctions policy, the trying to get people to turn against the Putin government, it's completely failed.
Absolutely.
All you have to do is look at a video of that rally, and someone understands. I don't think there'd be a politician in the U.S. that could sell out a stadium the size of Luzhniki. I don't think that would be possible. But any other geopolitical political news to discuss?
I mean, the other big event is that they're now trying to put together some kind of a resolution in the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, and they're finding it very difficult because apparently leaders from the global South are not keen on this resolution at all, and apparently it was intended to be basically a rehash of the original resolutions that were put forward a year ago. And they've had to be watered down in order to attract any kind of support at all, and this is becoming apparently something of an embarrassment altogether. And on top of that, the Chinese have proposed to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, and they've been, the Russians have also joined. They're making demands for a resolution in the Security Council about the Nord Stream pipeline attacks. And you're not getting any reporting about this in the Western media. But again, the fact that the meetings at the Security Council that were supposed to be discussing this Chinese-Russian proposals about the investigating the Nord Stream attacks, those meetings have been repeatedly postponed, which again makes me think that the West is finding it very difficult to hold support from non-aligned countries together on the Security Council itself. Of course, the West can always veto a resolution in the Security Council. The United States, Britain and France have the veto power. They won't want to be put in a position where that happens, where a draft resolution, receives 9 votes, and the US, France, and Britain have to veto it. That would be very embarrassing indeed. But the fact, as I said, that there's been these repeated postponements suggests that there's a possibility, and I suspect there's a huge amount of arms twisting, bribing, and pressure, and threats, and all kinds of things going on in the background to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. We also have, real quick, we have the EU failing to agree on a 10th sanctions package.
Yes.
They'll get the sanctions package.
They'll
That's
get
also crumbling. And
crumbling.
the EU, we talked about this about a week. We talked about this about a week and a half ago, that the EU is also now openly admitting that there was no 300 billion, and the only thing that they could confiscate from Russian assets is something around 30, 35, or 37 billion. They're disappointed and shocked. You know, they're like, we can't find any of this 300 billion, and they're looking for it everywhere now, and they're openly admitting this now. And
Yes.
when we reported on this, I believe it was just a Bloomberg article that came out, but now it's out there in the open.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a fail on every level. Why are they bothering with the 10th package? I mean, the only thing that Biden came up with when he was in Warsaw, he was talking about there will be another American sanctions package. Why? I mean, it's not as if all the other 9 have succeeded. I mean, so why go on for a 10th? I mean, Charles Michel, who's the European Council president, has actually said, that they've run out of things to sanction. So why go on with this charade of coming up with sanctions? All that it's doing is exposing their weakness. It's not making it. It's not impressing anybody. It's not scaring anybody. But of course, they go on doing it because if they stop doing it, they'd have to admit that the whole sanctions thing has been a failure, and they can't bring themselves to do that either. So they go on with sanctions packages. More and more countries become increasingly skeptical. Orban is openly critical about this, but one gets behind the scenes. Others also have their doubts. But this show still has to go on the road. They still have to go on piling on more sanctions, even though nobody believes any longer that these sanctions are going to work. The seizure of the Russian central bank's reserves, that failed. Now, remember, the Federal Reserve Board and the European Central Bank have actually said that if they'd been consulted about this, they didn't vote it. And they were cut out. They weren't informed that the sanctions on the Russian central bank were going to be imposed. And it seems that Western banks weren't told about it either. So keeping it secret in that way, clearly, in the end, negated the effectiveness of the sanctions, because it meant that since they weren't going to discuss it with the